The flight attendant's voice rose loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm going to ask you one last time, move to the back of the plane, or I will call security." Her words carried a sharp edge, her tone dripping with condescension. Helen, the black woman, calm as ever, looked up at her. "I've already told you I'm not moving," she said simply. Her tone was even, almost soothing, but it held an undeniable strength. She was being humiliated in front of everyone, but no one expected what would happen next, when the woman they thought was powerless stood up and revealed who she really was. The plane gleamed under the afternoon sun, its sleek design promising a luxurious journey for its passengers. Inside, the cabin was nothing short of opulence. Plush leather seats, gold accents, and an air of exclusivity that made everyone inside feel like royalty. Passengers moved with ease, their expensive luggage rolling behind them as they were ushered toward the private jet waiting on the tarmac. Soon they settled into their spots, some scrolling through their devices, others sipping champagne offered by the attentive flight crew. A soft ambient melody played in the background, completing the atmosphere of indulgence. Among them was Helen Kalin, a poised woman in her late 30s, dressed in a tailored white blazer and matching slacks. She exuded an understated elegance, moving with quiet confidence, though she made no effort to draw attention to herself. Helen stepped into the cabin, her presence commanding an unspoken respect. Her steps were measured, and her gaze swept across the cabin before she moved toward her seat. This wasn't just another trip, it was a journey to oversee her growing empire. But no one on board knew that yet. And for now, she preferred it that way. Near the entrance, Linda, the lead flight attendant, stood tall in her crisp uniform, her sharp features exuding control. She greeted the passengers one by one, her smile warm for some, colder for others. Linda prided herself on maintaining order on the plane, though her idea of order often depended on appearances. As Helen approached, Linda's welcoming tone subtly shifted. "Welcome aboard," she said curtly, the warmth noticeably absent. Behind Helen, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond, a couple in their 60s, settled into their seats. Mrs. Raymond clutched a small knitting bag, her fingers already twitching to begin her work, while Mr. Raymond held a folded newspaper, his expression one of mild curiosity as he took in the scene. Linda's smile brightened instantly for them. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond. Lovely to have you with us again." Helen glanced over her shoulder, noting the stark contrast in Linda's tone. Her expression remained calm, though her eyes reflected an awareness of the unspoken dynamics at play. As the other passengers settled, Linda moved through the cabin, ensuring everything was in place. She checked on the Raymonds, offering them another warm smile. "Is there anything I can get for you before we take off?" Mrs. Raymond shook her head politely, already absorbed in her knitting. Mr. Raymond nodded toward his coffee, indicating his satisfaction. But when Linda passed Helen, her demeanor shifted again. She glanced at Helen's bag, resting neatly under the seat, her lips pressing into a thin line. She offered no courtesy, no acknowledgement, just walked by without a word. Linda Reed, in her early 40s, carried herself with the precision of someone who thrived on control. Her pristine uniform and perfectly coiffed hair matched her sharp demeanor. To Linda, appearances mattered more than anything, and her judgments were swift and unapologetic. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Helen settle in. Something about Helen didn't sit right with her, not her clothes, not her quiet self-assurance, not the fact that she didn't immediately seek attention like many of the passengers Linda deemed worthy of respect. In Linda's mind, Helen simply didn't belong. With quick, purposeful strides, she approached Helen, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but dripping with condescension. "I think you're in the wrong section." Helen glanced up, her expression calm. "I believe this is my seat," she replied, her voice steady. Linda's smile didn't waver, but her tone sharpened. "I don't think so. This section is reserved for our elite passengers." Nearby, other passengers began to notice the exchange. A nosy socialite leaned slightly to get a better view, her curiosity piqued. A friendly businessman across the aisle frowned slightly at Linda's tone. Helen remained composed, her gaze unwavering. You might want to double-check your passenger list before making assumptions. Linda's eyebrows arched, her irritation barely hidden. I don't need to check anything, she said sharply. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. Tension thickened in the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering quietly. Others, uncomfortable, pretended not to notice. One passenger muttered, "Why doesn't she just move if she's in the wrong seat?" Another shrugged. She's probably trying to sneak in for a free upgrade. Linda crossed her arms, standing her ground. If you don't move to the back of the plane, she said, her voice loud enough for others to hear, I'll have to call security. Helen tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. Call whoever you need to, she said. But I'm not moving. The nosy socialite gasped softly. The businessman leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Linda, now visibly frustrated, turned to the junior flight attendant, Grace, who stood nearby watching nervously. Grace. Linda snapped. Escort her to the back now. Grace hesitated, glancing between Helen and Linda. She wanted to speak up, to say something about checking the passenger list as Helen had suggested, but Linda's sharp glare froze her in place. Reluctantly, she nodded and stepped forward. Helen shifted slightly in her seat, her calm demeanor still intact. You might want to think carefully about what you're doing, she said softly, her words carrying more weight than Linda realized. Linda scoffed, waving off the warning. I know exactly what I'm doing, she said. Now get up. Linda's tone grew sharper as she gestured toward the back of the plane. You're not supposed to be here, she said again, her voice now tinged with impatience. The passengers watched in stunned silence, the tension crackling in the air like static. Helen leaned back slightly, her gaze steady on Linda. You shouldn't make assumptions about people, she said quietly. Linda's smirk widened. And you shouldn't be in seats you didn't pay for. The cliffhanger came as Helen finally picked up her phone, her calm expression unchanging. She typed something quickly, then set it back down on the armrest. You're making a mistake, she said simply, her words hanging in the air. Linda didn't listen. We'll see about that, she muttered, gesturing again for Grace to act. The junior attendant stepped closer, her hesitation palpable as the scene continued to unfold. Linda's irritation only grew as Helen remained seated, her quiet confidence a stark contrast to Linda's increasingly flustered demeanor. The tension in the cabin thickened with every passing moment, drawing the attention of nearby passengers who watched the exchange with curiosity and disbelief. Linda's voice rose loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm going to ask you one last time, move to the back of the plane, or I will call security. Her words carried a sharp edge, her tone dripping with condescension. Helen, calm as ever, looked up at Linda. I've already told you I'm not moving, she said simply. Her tone was even, almost soothing, but it held an undeniable strength that only infuriated Linda further. A woman ahead, a nosy socialite with perfectly coiffed hair and an air of entitlement, leaned toward her companion. She whispered loudly enough for others to hear, looks like she's trying to sneak in for a free ride. Linda seized on the comment, her smirk returning. That's exactly what it looks like, she said, folding her arms and turning to the other passengers as though rallying support. We have rules for a reason. Some people just don't respect them. Helen didn't respond to the insults or the growing murmurs around her. Instead, she kept her gaze steady on Linda, her composure a quiet defiance that spoke louder than any word. Grace hesitated, then took a step toward the passenger list clipped near the cockpit door. Her fingers trembled as she scanned the names, hoping to find something that would help Helen. But before she could say anything, Linda snapped. Grace, what are you doing? Grace turned, her voice barely above a whisper. I was just checking. I've got this under control, Linda interrupted, her tone sharp. You don't need to get involved. Grace stepped back, her face flushing with embarrassment. She bit her lip, torn between doing what she knew was right and the fear of losing her job. As the tension built, a kindly-looking man seated across the aisle leaned forward. The businessman, dressed in a crisp suit and exuding a calm demeanor, smiled at Helen. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Is everything all right?" Helen turned to him, her expression softening. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice steady but grateful for the small act of kindness. Before the businessman could say more, Linda interjected, her tone accusing. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage the disturbance." She turned back to Helen, pointing a finger at her. "You're causing a scene." The businessman frowned. "From where I'm sitting," he said calmly, "you're the one making a scene." Linda's face flushed with anger, and she turned her attention back to Helen. "I've had enough of this," she snapped. "Either you move, or I'll make sure you're escorted off this plane." Helen met her gaze without flinching. "You can try," she said softly. Linda's frustration boiled over. Her voice shook as she leaned closer to Helen. "Why don't you just admit you're in the wrong seat and stop wasting everyone's time?" Helen remained silent, her calmness only fueling Linda's anger. Linda finally left Helen alone and turned to carry out her other duties. Angrily, Linda moved briskly down the aisle, her polished shoes clicking softly on the carpet. She carried a tray of sparkling water, her demeanor professional but her expression tight with irritation. Helen sat quietly in her seat, her attention focused on the book in her hands. Passengers chatted softly, the atmosphere calm, until Linda's subtle hostility began to surface. Helen had been waiting patiently for a drink, watching as Linda served Mr. and Mrs. Raymond first, then moved to others in the back. Linda, however, made no effort to acknowledge Helen. The tray was nearly empty when Helen finally spoke, her tone gentle. "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" Linda paused, glancing at Helen with a dismissive look. "I'll get to you when I can," she said curtly, walking past without another word. Helen's calm gaze followed Linda's retreating figure, but she remained silent. Minutes passed, and Helen shifted in her seat, trying to find a more comfortable position. She stretched one leg slightly into the aisle, her movement unassuming. Linda returned, tray in hand, her sharp eyes catching the small adjustment. Instead of asking Helen to move her leg, Linda deliberately changed her path. In an instant, Linda's foot struck Helen's leg. The tray tilted, and the glasses of water tumbled forward, splashing onto Helen's lap and the floor. Linda gasped theatrically, her voice sharp and loud. "Watch where you're putting your legs. You've caused a mess." Passengers turned their heads, startled by the commotion. Helen looked up, startled but composed. Her hands brushed at the water on her trousers. She said calmly, "But you walked into my leg." Helen tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze unwavering. "I've only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else," she replied. "And if that's too much to ask, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The words hung in the air, a quiet yet powerful rebuke. Linda's face flushed with anger. She stepped closer, her frustration boiling over. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she hissed, her voice sharp. Then, in a shocking moment, unable to contain herself, Linda raised her hand and slapped Helen across the face. The sound echo through the cabin like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the passengers. The businessman stood halfway, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. Grace's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Even the nosy socialite appeared taken aback, her previous smirk replaced by a look of unease. Helen slowly straightened, her hand resting calmly on her lap. Her expression remained composed, her gaze steady as she looked up at Linda. The cabin was silent, the tension palpable. Helen now sat fully upright. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes carried a weight that made Linda hesitate for the first time. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Helen said quietly, her voice calm but cutting through the air like a knife. Lindas Expression darkened. Her jaw tightened, and her hands clenched at her sides. Cross the line, she snapped, her voice rising. You're the one who's been disruptive since you got on this plane. Helen didn't flinch. She didn't touch her face or respond in kind. Instead, she straightened her posture, her gaze fixed firmly on Linda. Her calm demeanor remained intact, even in the face of such blatant aggression. You'll regret that, Helen said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire cabin. Linda faltered for a moment, her confidence shaken by Helen's unyielding composure. But she quickly recovered, scoffing loudly. Regret it? She sneered. What are you going to do? Call the police. Helen didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes, and the passengers could feel the shift in power. From the corner of the cabin, Grace, the younger flight attendant, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and determination. She had been quietly observing Linda's behavior all day, her discomfort growing with every passing moment. Now she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Discreetly, Grace stepped away from the commotion and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number quickly, her fingers trembling slightly. When the call connected, her voice was hushed but firm. It's Grace, she said. We have a situation on the plane. Grace returned to her post, her face a mix of worry and determination. Linda, oblivious to the call, stood with her arms crossed, her anger simmering but her authority waning. Helen remained seated, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Linda's rage. Passengers continued to watch, their eyes darting between Helen and Linda, unsure of what would happen next. One of them leaned toward Helen, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you okay? She asked, her concern genuine. Helen turned to her, offering a small, reassuring smile. I'm fine, she said softly. The tension in the cabin was thick, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the plane's engines. It was clear the situation was far from over. Helen remained seated, her posture steady despite the water dripping onto her clothing. She looked at Linda, her voice calm but firm. All you had to do was treat me with respect. But you failed, because of your prejudice, thinking I don't belong here just because you feel so. Linda's irritation deepened. Her grip on the tray tightened as she leaned closer, her tone mocking. Respect? Maybe you should earn it first. People like you don't deserve my respect. The tension in the cabin escalated. Passengers exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats, unsure of how to react. The unspoken question lingered in the air, how far would this go? At this point, Helen's anger rose. You shouldn't have said that, she said, her voice sharp but firm. Her words carried an unspoken weight, leaving everyone in the cabin wondering what would happen next. Linda folded her arms, her anger still simmering. Oh please, she scoffed. I've been more than patient with you. Maybe now you'll understand that actions have consequences. Helen's eyes narrowed slightly, her calm demeanor still unbroken. You're right, she said softly, her words deliberate. Actions do have consequences. And you're about to find out just how true that is. For a moment, Linda faltert. Something in Helen's tone sent a chill down her spine. But she quickly pushed the feeling aside. I'm not afraid of your empty threats, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. You're the one who will regret this, not me. Linda turned away, feigning confidence, but deep inside, unease began to creep in. She had crossed a line, and though she wouldn't admit it, she knew it. The looks from the passengers, the horrified expression on Grace's face, and Helen's quiet composure, it all made Linda feel as though the walls were closing in. She tried to shake it off, but her thoughts raced. What if this woman isn't who I think she is? The way Helen carried herself, the way she spoke with such calm authority, it didn't match Linda's assumptions. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced her anger. Linda's unease grew stronger as she replayed the moment in her mind. Why didn't she yell or fight back? Why did she say I'd regret it? Her stomach twisted as the realization hit her. She had let her prejudice and anger take over, and now she could smell trouble coming. Linda glanced around the cabin, hoping to find some support, but the passengers were no longer on her side. The businessman glared at her, his arms crossed in silent judgment. The nosy socialite whispered to her companion, shaking her head disapprovingly. Grace looked like she wanted to disappear, her hands trembling as she clutched the passenger list. Helen, meanwhile, remained seated, her expression calm but unreadable. She crossed her legs slowly, leaning back in her seat with a quiet confidence that only deepened Linda's unease. Helen didn't need to raise her voice or react aggressively. Her silence alone spoke volumes. The tension in the cabin thickened as Linda tried to regain control of the situation, but no matter what she said or did, she couldn't shake the feeling that her actions were about to catch up to her. Helen's words echoed in her mind, "You're making a mistake." Unbeknownst to Linda, Helen had already sent a message, and her quiet response to the slap wasn't submission, it was strategy. Trouble was brewing, and Linda was about to find out just how big of a mistake she had made. The cabin was thick with tension as Linda paced back and forth near Helen's seat, frustration bubbling over. Yet, Helen remained calm and composed, as if the entire situation were beneath her. Then, without a word, Helen reached for her phone. Her movements were deliberate as she typed something quickly before setting the device on the armrest beside her. The gesture was simple, but it carried an unspoken power that made Linda glance uneasily at the phone. "What do you think you're doing?" Linda asked sharply. Helen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her demeanor unwavering. "You'll find out soon enough," she said softly, her words carrying a weight that made Linda's unease deepen. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the plane's engines. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. The nosy socialite leaned toward her companion and murmured, "What's going on? Do you think she's someone important?" Across the aisle, the businessman sat quietly, a knowing look on his face. He tapped his fingers against the armrest, his gaze fixed on Helen, as though he had pieced together something no one else had. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps came from the front of the cabin. The cockpit door opened, and the pilot stepped out, his face pale and his expression tight. He scanned the room briefly before walking directly toward Linda, his movements quick and deliberate. Linda turned to him, irritation evident. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone sharp. The pilot stopped in front of her, his posture tense. "You need to step aside," he said, his voice firm but laced with discomfort. Linda frowned, confusion evident. "Excuse me," she said, crossing her arms. "Why would I need to step aside? I'm handling this." The pilot's gaze flicked to Helen, then back to Linda. "I just received a call from management," he said. "The owner of the plane is on board." He pointed to Helen. "Miss Williams. Hayes wird sitze room like Attendant club." Gasps erupted among the passengers. The nosy socialite audibly inhaled, her eyes widening as she looked between Helen and Linda. "She owns the plane," she whispered, disbelief thick in her voice. The businessman nodded knowingly, his expression calm. "I had a feeling," he muttered, as though this revelation confirmed his suspicions. Grace, standing near the galley, froze in place. Relief washed over her face as the realization hit. Helen wasn't just another passenger. She was someone far more powerful than anyone had realized. Linda, meanwhile, stared at the pilot, her face turning an alarming shade of red. That can't be true," she stammered, her voice losing its usual sharpness. "There must be some mistake." The tension in the cabin was palpable, the silence only broken by the hum of the engines. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the memory of the slap still fresh in their minds. Linda stood in the aisle, arms crossed, defiance evident despite the growing discomfort around her. Helen remained seated, her posture poised, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Then, without warning, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, We will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and prepare for descent.
Passengers murmuret in Konfusion.
The businessman leaned toward Helen and whispered, "What's happening? Why are we landing?" Helen didn't answer. Her expression remained serene but unreadable. Linda's brow furrowed, her confidence faltering as she glanced nervously toward the front of the cabin. The plane touched down smoothly, and moments later, a sleek black SUV pulled up directly to the tarmac. The doors opened, and two sharply dressed assistants stepped out, their movements brisk and purposeful. They ascended the plane's steps with quiet authority, their presence commanding attention the moment they entered the cabin. "Miss Williams," one of them said warmly, their voice respectful.
"Everything is ready for your review."
Gasps rippled through the cabin. Linda froze, her face draining of color as realization hit her like a wave.
"Miss Williams? She stammeret, her voice barely up over a whisper."
The assistants ignored her, their focus entirely on Helen. "Do you need anything before we proceed?" one of them asked, their tone deferential. Helen stood slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. She adjusted her blazer, her calm demeanor radiating power. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Helen finally spoke, her voice steady and commanding. "I'm Helen Kalin," she began, her gaze sweeping across the cabin. "I'm the owner of this plane. And I'm also the owner of this airline." Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The confident, condescending flight attendant was now a pale shadow of herself, her earlier bravado replaced by sheer panic. Helen turned her attention to Linda, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Linda, your behavior today has been nothing short of disgraceful," she said, her words cutting through the silence. "You've humiliated yourself, mistreated a passenger, and tarnished the reputation of this airline." Linda stammered, her voice trembling. I didn't know." Helen held up a hand, silencing her. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to treat me with the respect that every passenger deserves," she said firmly. "Instead, you made assumptions, acted with prejudice, and escalated a situation that could have been handled with basic decency." A murmur of agreement rippled through the passengers. Their earlier silence gave way to nods of approval, admiration glowing on their faces. Mr. Raymond folded his newspaper neatly, giving Helen an approving nod. Helen finally stood, her movements deliberate and controlled. She straightened her blazer and looked directly at Linda, her gaze calm but commanding. "There is no mistake in your actions, Linda," she said. Though quiet, her voice carried an authority that silenced the entire cabin. Linda's eyes darted around, searching for someone to support her, but no one came to her defense. Some passengers discreetly raised their phones, recording every moment. Helen took a step closer, her tone unwavering. "While you were busy judging me," she said, "you failed to do your job. Your duty is to treat every passenger with respect, no matter who they are or what you assume about them. And now, there are consequences." Linda's hands clenched at her sides. Her mind raced, scrambling for a response, but the weight of everyone's gaze crushed any confidence she had left. Helen turned to the pilot. "I want this addressed immediately," she instructed. "And I want to ensure that this never happens again." The pilot gave a firm nod.
"Unterstoot, Miss Williams."
Linda took an uneasy step back, panic setting in. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but before she could make a move, the pilot stepped into her path, his expression firm.
"You're not going anywhere."
Helen's gaze remained steady. "Linda, your actions today have proven that you are unfit for this position. Effective immediately, you are fired." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Linda's face crumpled, her arrogance replaced by sheer panic. "Please, Miss Williams," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean."
Helen's expression hardened.
"You didn't mean to get caught," she said coldly. "But you did. And now, you'll face the consequences." At that moment, two uniformed police officers boarded the plane.
Avef of mormos svept trug se kabin.
Linda's face turned ashen as they approached. Miss Williams, one of the officers said respectfully, we received your report. Are you pressing charges? Helen's gaze didn't waver. Yes, she said firmly. This individual assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. I expect her to be held accountable.
Linda gaspet, stumbling back.
Wait. This is a misunderstanding, she cried. I didn't mean to. One of the officers stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault, he said. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
Lindas bretin quickenet es reality sank in.
Her gaze flicked to Helen, who remained calm and composed, a stark contrast to her unraveling demeanor. Passengers watched in stunned silence as Linda's hands were cuffed behind her back. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to protest.
Please, Miss Williams.
I'm sorry, she sobbed. Helen's expression remained impassive. Your apology means nothing without accountability, she said quietly.
You made your choices. Now you will face the consequences.
As the officers led Linda down the aisle, she was no longer the dominant, condescending flight attendant. She was now a defeated figure, her arrogance stripped away, replaced by regret and humiliation. Helen turned back to the cabin, addressing the passengers in a steady voice. To everyone here, I apologize for what you had to witness today. This is not the standard of service I expect on my planes. Moving forward, we will ensure that every passenger is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The cabin erupted into applause. Mr. Raymond gave a small cheer, while Mrs. Raymond set her knitting aside to clap politely. Helen then turned to Grace, the younger flight attendant who had quietly supported her throughout the ordeal. Grace, Helen said, her tone softening. I noticed your professionalism today. Thank you for stepping up when it mattered. You'll be hearing from my office about a promotion.
Grace's eyes widened in shock.
She nodded quickly, her face lighting up with gratitude. Thank you, Miss Williams, she said softly. Helen gave her a brief but warm smile before stepping toward the exit, her assistants following closely behind. The atmosphere on the plane had completely shifted. The earlier tension was gone, replaced by admiration and relief. Justice had been served, and Helen had set an example no one on that flight would forget. As she made her way down the aisle, a woman who had been watching the ordeal with wide-eyed fascination leaned forward in her seat. Miss Williams, you're amazing, she blurted out, admiration shining in her eyes. Helen turned to her with a gentle smile. Thank you, she replied.
Remember this moment.
It's always worth standing up for what's right. As Helen stepped off the plane, the fresh air of the tarmac greeted her. A sleek black SUV waited nearby, the driver holding the door open. Her assistants walked beside her, briefing her on her next meeting, but her thoughts lingered on the day's events. Later, in a televised interview, Helen sat in a sleek studio, her posture poised as ever. The interviewer leaned forward, clearly captivated. Miss Williams, your story has gone viral. Millions of people have seen how you handled this situation. What message do you want to send? Helen's gaze was steady as she answered, her voice clear and resolute. Respect is a right, not a privilege, she said. Everyone deserves dignity, no matter how they look, where they come from, or what others assume about them. True leadership is about setting that standard and ensuring it's upheld. The interviewer nodded, visibly moved. And what would you say to those who face similar challenges, but don't have the platform you do? Helen's expression softened. I'd say that strength comes from within. Even when you feel invisible, remember your worth. You don't need a title or wealth to demand respect. You just need to stand firm in who you are. A few weeks later, Helen boarded another flight. This time, she was greeted by a different crew, one that radiated warmth, professionalism, and genuine kindness. The lead flight attendant approached her with a bright smile. Welcome aboard, Miss Williams. It's an honor to have you. Helen returned the smile as she settled into her seat. The atmosphere felt lighter, the service impeccable. But more importantly, it was filled with respect. She gazed out the window, watching the runway blur beneath the ascending plane.
A sense of peace washed over here.
The events of that fateful day had left a lasting impact, not just on the passengers and crew who had witnessed them firsthand, but on everyone who had followed the story as it unfolded. Helen knew her actions had turned an injustice into a lesson, one that would ripple far beyond a single flight. She smiled, knowing that sometimes, the most powerful victories weren't about winning, they were about inspiring change. As the passengers settled into their seats, Helen quietly reached for her phone. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about changing a system that allowed prejudice and assumptions to thrive. The jet climbed higher into the clouds. Helen leaned back in her seat, the window beside her framing a breathtaking view of the horizon. Below, the world faded into a sea of blue and white. This wasn't just about confronting bias or asserting authority. It was about transforming a moment of humiliation into a powerful lesson, one that would extend far beyond a single flight. Helen smiled at her reflection in the window, barely visible against the backdrop of the sky. She knew this was just the beginning. With every decision, every policy, and every act of leadership, she was shaping a future where respect and kindness weren't exceptions, they were the standard. The plane soared higher, its engines humming softly as it moved toward its destination. And Helen, seated at the helm of her vision, felt a quiet triumph, one that no turbulence could ever shake. Shortly after the flight, Helen released a public statement that resonated across the world. "Luxury isn't about appearances," she said in a heartfelt video that quickly went viral. "It's about the experience we create for everyone. True success isn't measured by what you can afford, but by how you treat others. That's why I'm implementing new policies across my airline, to ensure that every passenger, no matter who they are, feels valued and respected." If you loved this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share it with those around you.